and welcome back to the tutorial on capturing mental representations through drawing and crowdsourced scoring. Again, I highly encourage you to take a look at the affiliated paper as well as the OSF repository containing all the code that I present here in this video series. So in lesson 3, I'm going to tell you about how to host your experiment. So now that you've coded your experiment, how do you actually recruit participants and collect data and save the data? So in making those decisions, there's several factors to consider. So first, how do you want to recruit your participants? Second, where will the experiment be hosted? Third, where will the data be saved? And fourth, how will participants be compensated? And depending on the choices you make on these different routes, it constrains the different tools that you can use. So the easiest route, I would argue, is to use a platform like Amazon Mechanical Turk. AMT, Amazon Mechanical Turk, is an online marketplace in which you can upload tasks and then pay participants to perform these tasks. And they often have a base of over 10,000 people available at any time to participate in these tasks. And so if you decide to go the AMT route, then the answer to those 4 previous questions is that you'll recruit participants on AMT, the experiment will be hosted on AMT, the data will be saved on AMT, and you will compensate participants through AMT. What's great is it already has a huge set of participants, so it's easy to do recruitment, and AMT also handles the payment of the participants. So really the main thing you have to worry about is coding the experiment, uploading it to AMT, and then saving the data. So let me show you a little bit what that would look like. So this is the Mechanical Turk interface. I'm here on the developer sandbox. I highly recommend you use this whenever you're testing out an experiment for the first time. It allows you to upload tasks and also try participating them as if you were a worker without any money being exchanged. And so here we have that example 1 that exists in our code base for our drawing tutorial. You can just publish the batch and you can see what the task looks like. When you're creating the task for the first time, you go to create a new project. You can set all these different parameters about how many people you want to recruit, how much you want to pay them. But the key thing is that if you go to design layout and source, you can copy and paste that text that you wrote in your text editor for the code of your experiment into the source here. So I've directly copied what was from example1.html in my code base directly into here. You then just save it and you have your experiment. You can then publish it online. And so let me just show you again what that publication process looks like. You hit publish batch. You can look at what the task looks like. You can hit next and then see how much it's going to cost. Since we're on the sandbox, it doesn't cost anything. And then you just hit publish. So I've already published a version previously. So I'm going to show you what it looks like from the worker side of things. So I'm now on the worker side of the sandbox. And you can see we have our drawing tutorial example 1 here with the Bainbridge lab. You can then try out the task. You just say accept and work. And then there's the task right there. And so what you end up getting when you when you participate in an AMT experiment is the experimenter ends up getting a CSV file. If you go to manage, you can see all the data that comes in from an experiment. So you can see here it's waiting for the data from drawing tutorial. And actually, in the code base that I've uploaded for this example 1, you can see there's this example1 data.csv. This is actually pretty much what you get out of Mechanical Turk. Right now, it looks like gobbledygook. In a later lesson, I'll tell you what this all is. But essentially, this is returning our drawing right here. So this is a text representation of our drawing. So all our data is here and intact. And so what's great about Mechanical Turk is that it hosts your data once it's collected, and you just have to go in and download the CSV file to get it. However, there's many reasons you might not want to use Amazon Mechanical Turk for your experiment. For example, perhaps you want to recruit a specific pool of participants where you don't want them to have to make an AMT account to participate. Or maybe you want higher quality data because recently there's been concerns about data quality on AMT not being very high. So then you can take an intermediate route, like a hodgepodge route, where you sort of hodgepodge together many different tools for doing a online experiment. So when thinking about how you will recruit participants, you could still recruit them through AMT and then route them to an external experiment. You could also recruit people using Prolific. This is a recent resource that's gained a lot of traction. It's reported to collect or recruit higher quality participants, and it also pairs them a fairer wage. But one problem with Prolific is that it doesn't actually handle the hosting of your experiment or your data, so you have to handle that on your own. You can also recruit participants in more traditional ways, like through social media, like Twitter, Reddit, or Facebook. You can also use methods that you would use in person, like flyers or through classes, but still send those students or individuals a link to a website. Then with this hodgepodge approach, you will need to find another platform that can host your experiment. Some example platforms are Cite Toolkit is a great free website that lets you design experiments in a very easy to code way, and it can also handle the saving of your data. Cognition, the URL is cognition.run, also is a great way to host experiments. It can host JavaScript-based experiments. And also Qualtrics is very popular, especially if you have more survey questionnaire style experiments. And luckily, these three services can also save your data, so Cite Toolkit, Cognition, and Qualtrics. However, for compensation, you'll have to handle that yourself. If you use AMT or Prolific for recruitment, they can also handle the payment of your participants. But otherwise, if you're using other methods of recruitment like social media or in-person methods, then you might need to compensate participants yourself through something like a money transfer app or maybe through a gift card. So that's a hodgepodge approach. There's also what I would consider the most powerful route, which is do everything yourself. Specifically, host your experiment on a private server, host your database on a private server. This lets you exactly control your experiment and how data is saved. Many of these other platforms I've mentioned may have restrictions in what you can do with your experiment. So they might prevent you from having external pages on your experiment, maybe from something like playing videos, having very dynamic or interactive features. But if it's your own experiment, you can basically put in anything that you are able to code. What's great about a private server is that you're also not dependent on a third-party service. So you have control over how secure the data is. You also don't need to necessarily pay any third parties, though you do need to pay to host to have a private server. And finally, what's great about a private server is that you can create your own easy link that you can send to participants without requiring them to register for any sort of service. So for example, when we were recruiting individuals with aphantasia on the internet, we did that experiment through a private server so we could send them a link that we knew was going to work and that they didn't need to register for. And so I'm going to now tell you a little bit about how you can host experiments on your own server. And to do this, we need to return to the prior discussions about web architecture. So in the last lesson, I told you about client-side scripting. I told you about HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. But if you want to interact with a server and a database on a server, there's a few more languages you need to pick up. And these are languages that are called server-side scripting languages that essentially allow you to interact with a database. Some of the ones I'm going to talk about today are MySQL and PHP. And one really differentiating feature of these server-side scripting languages is that the user of a web page does not have access to this code. It would actually be dangerous if they had access to this code because then they'd be able to get into your database. And so MySQL, this stands for My Structured Query Language. This is essentially the database system, or this allows you to interact with your database system. It lets you do things like insert, delete, and search data in your database. So here's an example of a MySQL command. It's saying that we want to insert this new record into this table that I've called here registration. And we specifically want to insert something into the column called name. And in that, we want to put in this record that's saved in this variable that I've called here inputted name. So again, MySQL is really about interacting with your database system. PHP, which stands for PHP Hypertext Processor. It's actually a recursive acronym. What that does is that it communicates between server files and the web page. So it essentially helps, it interacts with the MySQL code to work with the database, but it also interacts with the JavaScript and HTML you have that's seen by the client. And so one important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is us web users cannot see this code. Otherwise, it would be a security risk. PHP can include logic, like if statements, for loops. It can include math. It communicates with HTML usually through post and get tags. So you will post from an HTML page to a PHP page. And you can visually identify PHP because it resembles bash scripting. So it's characterized by things like $signs to define variables. And it also has curly braces and semicolons. And so here's an example of a really short snippet of PHP code. You can see here, it has the HTML carets, but this question mark PHP here says that this is PHP code. And what it's doing is that it's printing out or echoing this specific variable, the data saved in this variable called display performance. And we know it's a variable because it's defined by this $sign here. Again, I highly encourage you to visit w3schools.com to learn more about MySQL and PHP. And so now I'm going to show you what this actually looks like in the drawing tutorial code bases that I have available. And specifically, refer to example 4, because this is the example where we're actually interacting with a server. And so here, example 4 pretty much resembles example 3. That was the one where we had the timed trials where you saw an image, drawing interface, image, drawing interface, and then there were some questionnaire questions. The only difference is that we now have this process data.php script, and our HTML script now refers to it in a post statement. And if we look at this process data.php script, what it basically does is that it interacts with our database. It sends it all this information. So you can see this insert into here. And then it prints out some information as like a thank you to the user. So some things when you are using this script that you definitely need to change. You will need to input your database login information here. So you'll need to put in your host name, the name of the database, your username, and your password. And then also down here, when we're doing this insert into, here you will need to insert the name of the table that you're interacting with. Yep. And when I talk about setting up a database, so many website providers do also allow you to host databases on your web space. So as an example, I use Ionos. I haven't actually tried other services, so I've enjoyed my time with Ionos, but I don't have much of a point of comparison. And if I just go onto my Ionos's webpage, I can actually access my different MySQL databases. So you can see I have a bunch of different databases here, and I can actually interact with them on the web-based GUI. So it's actually pretty straightforward. So here I have the drawing tutorial database. And within it, I have a table called drawing tutorial. And you can see there's actually already some data saved into it when I was testing it out. And if you go and look at the information about the database, that's where you can get information like your host name, username, database name, etc. We can look at the structure of my database here. These are essentially what are the different columns that you have in your table. So if you have an Excel sheet, it's basically what are the names of the different columns in your Excel sheet. So I have here, we have the subject number. We are saving the 2 drawings that are made in the task. We're also saving the mouse movements for the 2 drawings. We're saving the coordinates of where the corners are on the drawing interface. And we also ask the participant for some basic demographic information at the end, their age, what device they're using, etc. when you're setting up the structure of your table, you also want to think about what the types are for your different variables. So for example, the drawing and mouse movement information, I set those as long text because they're very, very long strings of different coordinates. And we'll go into this a little bit in the next lesson. But for some values, I've set them to just integers. So the coordinates of where the drawing interface are, that's just going to look like something like 258 or 13. So I allow those to be integers. And then for these shorter responses, I allow those to be just text inputs. And so let me show you what the experiment actually looks like. So here I've taken that example 4. The code is available in the code base, and I've just uploaded it to my website. So it's live online at this URL here. And so now I'm just going to go through and make a sort of poor effort at reproducing these drawings. So as you can see, I just did 2 drawings. Now let's just put in some of this information. I'm using a tablet. I'm using a mouse. Those were not good drawings. And experience with artistic training, you know, as a kid, I did submit. And so when I hit submit, basically the HTML posted all the data I just created to this PHP page. In the PHP code, if you look through the code and the comments, it then interacts back with the HTML to produce this thank you message. I have a little example of it doing math, where it just makes a joke about how your drawings are pretty good for your age. Yeah, but importantly, what the PHP code is doing is it's again interfacing with that database, that MySQL database that I have on my server. So if we go back to the table, we should see there's now a 3rd row here of the new data that I just submitted. So here's actually the drawings that I just made. Here are the mouse movements that correspond to the drawings that I just made. Here are the coordinates of the drawing interface that I used. You can see the age here that I inputted. And I said that I used a laptop, a mouse, and my art experience was only when I was a kid. Right. One final thing is, how do you download this data? Well, it might differ based on however you're interfacing with your own database through your own web host. But for example, here, I can just use this easy export function, and I export it as a CSV file, a comma separated value file, which is easy you can open with a text editor. You can also open with a program like Excel. One thing is that sometimes the drawings can include commas. So in all the examples I've provided you, they're actually not separated. Individual cells are not separated by commas. They're separated by pipes, or these vertical lines. And we don't need the columns enclosed by any sort of quotes. So if I hit go, then, oh, Excel's not going to be able to open it actually, because it's not comma separated, but pipe separated. But let's just. And so this is the data that was saved out. Again, it might look like gobbledygook now, but this is actually all the drawing information. The mouse movements are here. And you can actually see some of the other responses. So in this, when I was testing it here, I said I was 999 years old and I was using a tablet and a joystick. So yeah, that's pretty much in a nutshell how you can host everything on your own web page. Basically, this wilmabainbridge.com is handling the presentation of the experiment, the saving of the data, and then I can easily download the data here from the MySQL interface. And so basically, if I sent this link to anyone, they would be able to participate in the experiment, and I'd immediately get the data like I did just now. So the main takeaway from this lesson is that there are many options for hosting your experiment, from hosting it on a service like Amazon Mechanical Turk or coding it all yourself. You'll need to assess what are your different needs. Do you want more flexibility, or do you want something that's easier to handle like Mechanical Turk? and that will ultimately guide your decision. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about how to save these drawings as data. So as you saw, these CSV files looked like pretty uninterpretable gobbledygook. How do we turn that back into a drawing? And how do we turn the mouse movements into a video of someone's mouse movements? Yeah, so see you then.